Welcome to my channel, Brain Decoded, the place where we translate the science of the mind into real life transformation. Today, I want to show you something profound, how you can rewire your brain in just 24 hours, yes, one day, by leveraging science-backed neuroplasticity, hacking strategies that can begin turning your life around. Stick with me, because by the end of this video, you'll have a clear, actionable plan, and you'll know exactly how to trigger real, measurable change in your brain. Starting now, neuroplasticity is often described as the brain's ability to change, but that definition doesn't quite capture the immediacy or the power behind it. What most people don't realize is that neuroplasticity isn't some slow, background mechanism that unfolds over months. It can begin ours within seconds of placing your brain into the right conditions. The circuitry inside your skull is constantly evaluating, updating, and reshaping itself in response to what you do, what you focus on, and the emotional weight you attach to those experiences. And when you learn how to trigger these mechanisms deliberately, change becomes not only possible, it becomes fast. The speed of neuroplasticity comes down to a few core principles. The first is Foster's focus. When your brain is highly focused, especially on something that feels just beyond your current abilities, specific neuromodulators begin to flood particular brain regions. Chemicals like acetylcholine act as a spotlight, narrowing your attention onto the task, marking the active synapses as important. This tagging process is what allows those circuits to become malleable. You're essentially telling your brain, this matters. Change this. Without focus, the brain remains in its default stability mode. With intense focus, the brain enters a plastic state, what scientists often call a window for neural change. But focus alone isn't enough. Neuroplasticity also relies on errors. Every time you try something and make a mistake, whether that's learning a new language, practicing a physical skill, or attempting to shift a mindset, your brain generates a set of signals indicating mismatch, what you intended versus what actually happened. That mismatch triggers the release of norepinephrine, a chemical that heightens alertness and flags the moment as an opportunity for correction. This is why learning often feels uncomfortable. The brain doesn't change when everything is smooth and predictable. It changes when something is off, when a gap emerges. In that gap is the biochemical spark of rewiring. Another key lever is error's emotional relevance. Your brain is constantly deciding what to keep and what to discard based on how important something feels. Strong emotions, even mild excitement, curiosity, urgency, or a sense of meaning boost dopamine, which further reinforces the circuits you activated during learning or behavior. Dopamine acts like a save button in the brain. When dopamine is released around a particular thought or action, the likelihood that the brain rewires around that pattern skyrockets. This is why attaching a clear purpose to your practices accelerates change. When the brain understands why something matters, it becomes more willing to reshape itself. What makes neuroplasticity fast isn't the activation itself, it's what comes after activation. The actual rewiring happens during periods of rest and sleep. During deep rest, including non-sleep deep rest states, the brain replays neural activity from the learning period at high speed, strengthening certain connections while weakening others. This replay can sometimes occur within minutes of a challenging learning session. And during sleep, especially slow-wave sleep, the brain consolidates those changes in a massive structural update. So while you might only spend an hour practicing something new, the next 6 hours of rest determine how much of that practice gets embedded into your circuitry. Fast neuroplasticity also depends on novelty. When you expose your brain to something unfamiliar, the hippocampus and other learning-related regions become highly active. The brain loves novelty because novelty signals opportunity, the possibility of new information, new skills, new survival advantages. Even small forms of novelty, like taking a different route to work, trying a different form of exercise, or deliberately altering your routines, can nudge plasticity systems into action. The combination of focused attention, error-driven learning, emotional engagement, novelty, and proper rest creates a potent formula for rapid change. You can feel the effects in real time, the slight frustration when learning something new, the spark of excitement when you improve even a little, the mental fatigue after intense focus. These sensations are not setbacks. They are evidence that plasticity is happening quickly. When you begin to understand how the brain decides when to change, you stop relying on motivation or vague hope. You start engaging the neurobiological levers that evolution designed specifically for transformation. Neuroplasticity is not only real, it's accessible, it's powerful. And when triggered deliberately, it's remarkably fast. Your brain is waiting for you to signal what matters. Once you do, it begins reshaping itself, sometimes in minutes, often dramatically within hours, and continually over days. Change isn't distant. It begins the moment you decide to focus, engage, challenge yourself, and allow the brain the rest it needs to rebuild. The state you're in determines whether your brain is open to change or locked into its existing patterns. Most people imagine that change comes purely from effort, pushing harder, focusing more, grinding through tasks. But the truth is, your internal state is the gateway that decides whether your brain is even capable of rewiring. You can apply all the effort you want, but if your state isn't aligned with plasticity, the brain treats your attempts like noise. When your state is aligned, however, the brain becomes highly receptive, almost like soft clay ready to be shaped. Your state is governed by the balance of your autonomic nervous system, the interplay between alertness and calm. You need a certain level of alertness to learn, but not so much that stress shuts down cognition. Likewise, you need calmness for consolidation, but not so much that your mind becomes dull or unfocused. The ideal plasticity window happens when you strike that balance, elevated alertness, combined with just enough relaxation to stay open, curious, and emotionally grounded. This is why breathwork, meditation, and physiological self-regulation techniques aren't just wellness practices. They're biological tools for shaping the brain. When you slow your breathing, especially extending the exhale, you shift the autonomic system toward parasympathetic dominance. This calms the body, reduces threat detection in the brain, and creates the space for new neural configurations to form. In this state, the brain is less defensive and more exploratory. Conversely, when you speed up inhalation or make your breathing more vigorous, you activate sympathetic pathways, increasing alertness and readiness. The key is knowing when to shift into each mode. Plasticity begins during stress or challenge, not the overwhelming kind, but manageable friction. When you're learning something new and it feels difficult, your state becomes heightened. This is good. The slight stress pushes neuromodulators like norepinephrine and acetylcholine into circulation, marking the activated circuits as candidates for change. But too much stress and the brain locks up. It narrows its focus too much, becomes rigid, and prioritizes survival rather than learning. That's why being aware of your internal state and intervening early is essential. You're not just managing emotions, you're managing the chemical environment that decides whether your brain rewires or resists. There are certain states that amplify plasticity far beyond what effort alone can accomplish. One of the most powerful is the deeply relaxed state found in non-sleep deep rest. Whether it's guided breathing, yoga nidra, or even a quiet body scan, these practices induce a drop in brainwave frequency toward alpha and theta ranges. In these states, the brain becomes highly flexible. Circuits loosen their connections, making it easier for new associations, ideas, and emotional patterns to take shape. These states mimic early stages of sleep when the brain is reassessing and reorganizing information. Spending even 10 to 20 minutes in such a state after a learning session can dramatically increase the rate at which the brain consolidates new skills or insights. State also determines how you interpret experiences. When you're in a stressed or overloaded state, neutral events often feel threatening or discouraging. The brain becomes biased toward negative learning. It's quicker to form circuits around avoidance, fear, or frustration. But when you're in a more regulated state, the same events feel manageable, even meaningful. Suddenly, mistakes become invitations to improve. Challenges feel like useful stress rather than danger. This shift isn't psychological only, it's neurochemical. The presence of dopamine, even in small amounts, combined with moderate levels of norepinephrine, primes the brain toward adaptive learning rather than defensive patterning. This is why cultivating your state before you engage in learning or change is so important. If you begin in a chaotic or scattered state, your brain is not positioned to encode the new experience properly. But if you enter the task with steady breathing, grounded attention, and a sense of calm readiness, your brain is biologically prepared to rewire. You can think of it as tuning an instrument before playing. The performance might happen during the focused effort, but the tuning determines whether the performance creates harmony or noise. There is also a unique window just before sleep and just after waking, the hypnagogic and hypnopompic phases. In these states, the brain naturally dips into theta rhythms, making it unusually receptive to new associations and insights. Many breakthroughs, both emotional and intellectual, happen here because the brain is temporarily freed from rigid patterns. You can deliberately engage this window by journaling before sleep, visualizing a new habit, or mentally rehearsing something you're trying to learn. The circuitry activated during these moments is far more likely to undergo modification. Ultimately, your state is the control dial for neuroplasticity. Change isn't simply about the actions you take, it's about the internal environment in which you take them. You can push hard, struggle, and force yourself through challenges, but without the right state, your brain won't interpret those efforts as signals for change. When you learn to regulate your state, when to elevate alertness, when to induce calm, when to enter deep rest, you gain access to the most powerful lever for transformation. With the right state, the brain becomes teachable, adaptable, and ready to evolve. And when that happens consistently, change comes not as a rare event, but as a natural progression. Behavioral anchors are the actions you repeat consistently that signal to your nervous system what it should strengthen, what it should weaken, and what it should prepare for. They are not habits in the traditional sense. They are cues, biological triggers, that tell your brain, this is the pattern we want more of, or this is the response we want to replace. When used deliberately, these anchors accelerate neuroplasticity because they create a predictable structure your brain can latch onto. The brain thrives on repetition, but it thrives even more on repeated behavior paired with a meaningful internal state. That combination is what makes an anchor powerful. When you engage in a behavior repeatedly, especially when you attach intention and focus to it, the neurons responsible for that behavior begin firing together with greater synchronicity. Over time, the synchrony becomes efficiency. The brain starts pruning away competing pathways and reinforcing the dominant one. But the real acceleration happens when you anchor the behavior to something you already do or something your brain already associates with importance. Anchoring leverages the brain's natural tendency to automate sequences. Once a behavior is linked to a cue, the brain begins predicting it, preparing for it, and allocating resources to support it. One of the most effective forms of behavioral anchoring is pairing a new behavior with a consistent time of day. The brain is rhythmic. Hormones, temperature, cognitive performance, and emotional states all oscillate in predictable patterns throughout the day. If you choose a specific window, for example, early morning for learning or late afternoon for physical skill development, you're capitalizing on rhythms the brain has been following your entire life. Over time, the brain begins anticipating the behavior, adjusting neuromodulators in advance, and opening the plasticity window right on schedule. Another powerful anchor is linking a behavior with AR's physiological shift. For instance, using a specific breathing pattern before practicing a skill or engaging in a mindset shift creates a state change that your brain comes to associate with plasticity. If every time you sit down to learn something or reframe a thought, you perform a cycle of deep inhales and long exhales, you're essentially telling the brain, we are entering a focused, malleable mode now. Eventually, the breathing alone becomes the cue that prepares the brain for learning. Behavioral anchors can also be emotional. When you pair a new behavior with a small, self-generated reward, even something as simple as acknowledging your progress out loud, you harness dopamine's power in consolidation. Dopamine doesn't just reinforce big wins, it reinforces patterns. A tiny reward after successfully executing a new behavior creates a loop of anticipation, action, reward. This loop accelerates learning. The brain begins to crave the behavior because it has become tied to the chemical signature of progress. Over time, the behavior becomes easier to perform and harder to break. Movement can act as a strong anchor as well. The brain evolved to wire itself in the context of physical activity. Even subtle movement, like a short walk, primes the hippocampus and enhances encoding. Many people underestimate how much faster they can learn or break patterns when they attach physical movement to the process. If you rehearse a new mindset, behavior, or skill while walking or during exercise, the associated circuits strengthen faster because movement naturally boosts neurochemicals like BDNF, which enhance plasticity. By making movement a precursor to your practice, you anchor rewiring to a state your brain already recognizes as adaptive. Similarly, reducing friction around a behavior is another form of anchoring. If the tools you need are always placed in the same location, if the environment is always set up in a predictable way, your brain uses environmental cues as anchors. This reduces the cognitive cost of engaging the behavior, freeing up more mental resources for the actual rewiring. When an environment becomes associated with a behavior, stepping into that space immediately activates the neural networks tied to that behavior. The brain loves context, and leveraging context speeds up change. Even language can be used as a behavioral anchor. The words you repeat to yourself shape your neural pathways. A phrase repeated consistently, especially under emotional load or focus, becomes a mental shortcut your brain learns to follow. Over time, the phrase triggers the neural state it represents. This is why athletes, performers, and high-pressure professionals use short, tight verbal cues. The brain trims away unnecessary processing and goes straight to the action. The most important thing to understand about behavioral anchors is that they don't need to be dramatic. They need to be as consistent, as intentional, and as paired with the right internal state. When the brain detects that a behavior is not random, but repeated and prepared for, it prioritizes that behavior for strengthening. Anchors take moments of effort and turn them into patterns. They transform isolated actions into biological instructions. When you begin to build anchors deliberately, tying new behaviors to rhythms, movements, breath, environment, or reward, you accelerate the pace at which your brain reorganizes itself. The rewiring happens faster because the brain is no longer guessing what matters. The cues tell it exactly where to focus, what to support, and what to prune away. Over time, with consistent anchors, the behavior shifts from effortful to automatic. And once it's automatic, it becomes part of who you are, not through force, but through biology. Recovery is often misunderstood as the passive part of change, the quiet background element that happens after the real work is done. But in reality, recovery is where the brain performs its most essential rewiring. Activation opens the door, but recovery is what allows the brain to walk through it and reorganize itself. Without proper recovery, even the most intense effort, the deepest focus, or the most disciplined practice won't lead to lasting neural change. The brain doesn't strengthen circuits during the moments of challenge, it strengthens them during the moments that follow. When you engage in focused learning or attempt to change a behavior, the brain enters a heightened plasticity state. Neuromodulators like acetylcholine, norepinephrine, and dopamine surge to mark the circuits involved as priority channels. But at that point, those circuits are only tagged, not yet rewired. They're in a fragile, malleable condition, almost like freshly poured concrete that hasn't set. This is why the period immediately after a learning session is so important. The brain needs time and the right conditions to stabilize, reorganize, and strengthen those newly activated pathways. One of the most powerful recovery mechanisms is ISFG sleep. During deep sleep, especially slow wave sleep, the brain engages in a process known as synaptic consolidation. It selectively reinforces the patterns you practice during the day while pruning away competing or irrelevant connections. This pruning is not a loss, it's refinement. A cleaner, more efficient circuit leads to better performance, clearer thinking, and more stable behavior. REM sleep also contributes by replaying emotional and cognitive scenarios, integrating them into long-term memory in a way that reduces friction and sharpens the patterns you want to solidify. What's remarkable is that this consolidation process often mirrors the learning experience itself. The brain replays neural activity at a much faster speed, sometimes 10 to 20 times faster, as if rehearsing the skill or thought pattern in miniature. You may not consciously experience this, but the internal circuitry is actively upgrading. Missing sleep or compromising its quality disrupts this process. It's the biological equivalent of practicing without letting the brain save the progress. Yet recovery isn't limited to sleep. Sleep deep rest plays an equally significant role. Practices like yoga nidra, guided deep relaxation, or even structured breathing protocols can push the brain into a state where sensory and cognitive load drops dramatically. In this state, the inhibition of certain networks and the relaxation of others creates an ideal condition for synaptic strengthening. What you practiced before entering deep rest becomes more likely to stick because the brain isn't being bombarded by new stimuli. Without ongoing interference, the circuits you activated earlier can reorganize with greater precision. There's also a fascinating interplay between fatigue and recovery. The mental strain you feel after focused work is not a sign that you're doing something wrong. It's the signal that plasticity has been activated. That fatigue represents biochemical changes, the depletion of neuromodulators, the buildup of metabolic byproducts, and the temporary weakening of circuits undergoing modification. Pushing through this fatigue often leads to diminishing returns, but giving yourself deliberate rest right at that point leverages the brain's natural timing. A short NSDR session, even 10 minutes, can restore neuromodulators and create the perfect internal environment for consolidation. Recovery also includes a psychological decompression. When stress levels remain elevated after learning or behavioral change efforts, the brain struggles to differentiate between patterns meant for strengthening and patterns meant for survival. Chronic stress floods the brain with cortisol, which interferes with the consolidation process and biases the brain toward reinforcing fear or avoidance pathways. This is why winding down is crucial. Light stretching, slow breathing, reduced sensory input, or even brief journaling helps lower stress hormones and allows the brain to shift into a restorative mode. Nutrition, hydration, and movement also support recovery. The brain is metabolically expensive. It needs adequate glucose, electrolytes, and blood flow to carry out the rewiring process. Light movement after learning, not intense exercise, but gentle walking, can enhance circulation and support the metabolic processes that underpin consolidation. The importance of recovery is most visible when you compare two people who engage in the same amount of learning or change effort. One pushes continuously without rest, the other alternates effort with strategically timed recovery. The second person always progresses faster, not because they work harder, but because they work with their biology rather than against it. The nervous system wasn't designed for endless output. It was designed for cycles of activation and restoration, tension and release, challenge and integration. When you begin to honor recovery as a central pillar, not an afterthought, your capacity for change expands dramatically. You start noticing that your mind becomes clearer, your skills sharpen more quickly, and your behavioral shifts take root more reliably. Recovery isn't a break from the process of rewiring. It is the process. It's where the brain decides what stays, what goes, and what becomes part of you. And when you give it the space to do that, change becomes not just possible, but inevitable. Here's the truth: your brain is not a static organ locked in by your past. It's dynamic, plastic, and deeply responsive to the choices you make, even in a single day. By intentionally activating learning, tuning your mental state, reinforcing new patterns, and giving yourself the rest to consolidate, you can begin to rewire your brain in just 24 hours. If you lean in, apply this with discipline, and stick to the process, your life doesn't just change, it transforms. You create a new baseline, a new default. So start today, pick one small action, dive in with focus, rest deeply, and let your brain do the work. I promise you, this is not wishful thinking, it's neuroscience. Thank you for watching Brain Decoded. If you found this helpful, like the video, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a breakdown of how you can literally sculpt your mind. Until next time, let's keep decoding, rewiring, and evolving together.